Who's from Seattle here? Okay, so I was there earlier this week. I am happier to be here. I did pick up a nice client when I was there. They play football, and so it's a fun new client to play with. I started out as a construction project manager for Southwestern Bell in 1978. Now, I can tell by some of you, you weren't born yet or you were in grade school at that time. But that was back in the day when we hand-counted pieces and parts of furniture with butter paper, and we circled all the connectors and things like that. And it was a much different world back then. It was also a time when Southwestern Bell was going through divestiture. So that was a fascinating time. Watching a company going from mechanical switches to digital switches. How many have ever seen a mechanical switching room in a telephone company? Okay, we've got a few. And so it's kind of like you go into this room of 20-foot high ceilings, 40-foot wide bays, and it's just these brass armatures, and you walk in there and you hear click, 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 click. So it's kind of like an audio version of the Matrix, with all these kind of dashes and dots, you know, that little armature sending signals through the world. And then I can remember one day, this big black box showed up from a company in Richardson, Texas called the Digital Switch Corporation, which is now Alcatel. And this box literally took the place of about 4 floors of switches, of mechanical switches. And then all of a sudden, the world changed. A little company called MCI. Anybody remember Friends and Family, MCI? Okay. So they were a little long-distance company that was only doing business across the world with the State Department on secured long-distance lines. But with divestiture coming up, they used to joke that MCI was really a law firm that played in the long-distance business because they sued and got divestiture going. And then all this craziness we've been experiencing has been because of this digital communications revolution. And it's now coming to education. Some of us have experienced it a little bit, but we still kind of live in a bubble, an education bubble. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. The other thing, too, is the title of the book was intentional. Because we found what's happened in education is that because of the era it was designed in, it wasn't designed for an era of complexity and kids who are really individuals. How many have kids who are unique and individual? Okay, right. And so what I found in this is that the system is not really good with one-offs. Kids that are unique have special kinds of gifts, talents, or challenges. About 50% of the kids are designed for the system we now have. I was designed for that system. You know, kids going through could take tests well, get into college. I was good for that. But the world has changed. So let's talk about it. The other thing I want to talk about, too, that's specifically related to us is this thing called LI and LX. How many have heard of user interface and user experience design? So if you've got any kind of digital object at all, somebody found that years ago, remember televisions when you had pliers to turn the channels? And you had, does anybody remember that? Were you sent to Walgreens to test the tubes like I was in a little brown bag? Okay. So you didn't really need user interface and user experience because it was pretty basic, pair of pliers, okay? But then what happened is that digital engineers went wild and they created these programming things that takes an engineering degree to know how to turn the television on or off or change channels. How many have experienced those? So they developed this science around user experience. What's it like for the user to use this thing? So one of the things we came up with is asking the question, what is the learner's experience and what's the learner's interface? So I want you to think about a place you go to that just has all the details down. Now, I happened to be at one of those places the last couple days. I was at Dana Point with a superintendent's conference, and it was at the Ritz-Carlton. And I tell you what user experience means, or user interface means, what are all the touch points that a user has? And they think about it so thoroughly. They think about when the person drives up, when they walk in, that's a touch point. When you walk through the hall, I found that, you get lost in that place on Dana Point easily. So I had a confused look on my face, and someone said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, just point me to the right direction." She insisted, "No, let me help you get there." Now, she may have looked at my age and figured that he's going to get lost anyway, so I better help him. But they're trained to make sure that your experience is frictionless. No friction. You get from point A to B. When I checked out, it was frictionless, and plus I was given 2 cookies on the way out. How good is that? So we don't oftentimes think about the learner experience from the time the child leaves the home to the time they get to the school, to the time they check in, to the time they go to their classroom. We know from at-risk communities that a lot of kids aren't prepared to go straight from walking in to going straight to cognitive load, right? Because what was their previous night like, probably? Didn't sleep well, they turned the television on to make sure they didn't hear the noise going on. They come in with what's called an amygdala hijack. Their cortisol is flowing. And so to go straight into cognitive load, when you're under stress, your prefrontal cortex does not operate. You're in reactive mode or in disengagement mode. Teachers who commute, who come running into class and then have 3 classes in a row, they're experiencing the same kind of cognitive overload called stress. How many have ever felt stress before? Do you know what I'm talking about, what stress is? Okay. And because of that, you have only 2 things you can do with your brain. You either react or you disengage. That's the only 2 things you can do. So think about this. 70% of our teachers are disengaged every single day. In other words, you have 70% of teachers who'd rather be any place else than at school today. Now, can a disengaged teacher produce an engaged student? That's a lot of what we explored. So we are in the business of dealing with facilities, right? How many are in the facility side of things? Construction or facilities? Okay, what's the root word for facility? Facilitate. But we oftentimes don't pause and think about what are we trying to facilitate? What is the experience? What are the touch points that we're creating? So a lot of us are pressed, and I was in the same role as a project manager. Here's my blueprint, here's my deadline, get it done. But I started asking the bigger questions long ago about, so what's actually happening to the people who are experiencing? Is this really working for the people that are using it? And one of the things we found in our research is that everybody is more important than the student. We found one school district where the teacher tried to be creative and take all the desks and arrange them in a way that they could do some team learning. This was a union school. So what happened that night is the janitorial service piled all of the desks in the corner and left a note. You do that one more time and you won't see the furniture because it takes us twice as long to clean a room when they're not in straight rows and columns than when you try to do your thing with it. So a lot of times the tail wags the dog, and part of what I want to do is help us have a mind shift to remember what we're here, we all have people we report to and budgets we are responsible for and timelines and all of that stuff. But in the end, why? What's it all for? So, a little background. I started out, this is the first book I wrote. It's a lousy title, but it's really about delivering projects that are on time, within budget, with trust-based teams that collaborate early, and everybody will talk to each other after the project. Okay? What a concept, yeah? But why did we write the book? And why did we do the research? Because that's not the norm. 70% of all projects come in late and over budget. 50% of those projects are 50% of the cost of most construction projects are waste and non-value added activity. So we wanted to get to the root of what drives all this waste and dysfunction and bad behavior. So that book came out in 2009. Then we were challenged by Google and said, okay, so you guys build great facilities, but guess what? People are still coming to work and they don't want to be here. So how can you, what is it that you're doing that adds value to me as an owner that helps me create experiences where my employees are more engaged? So that led us to this book, and how do you create engaging environments? How can you change culture through design? And how can you minimize resistance to change? Have any of you ever received or experienced resistance to the new plans that you were to execute? Anybody have resistance? I'm the only one? Do you have kids? Okay, then you've experienced resistance. What I like to say is that our real job in facilities and construction and move management is not that, it's grief management. That's our real job. We're handling people who are grieving and acting out and doing all that kind of behavior. So then that came to this project here, and I was approached by a company that said, you know what, the same kind of disengagement that you talked about in Change Your Space, Change Your Culture, it's in the school too, the same kinds of problems. In fact, you probably could have written the book and just changed some of the stories and it would work for school. And I said, well, I don't know anything about education, except I have 3 kids that went through school. But I got sucked into this project for 2 years, and it was the most meaningful project I was ever in. And it took me through my own personal journey with my kids and looked at it through a completely different light. This is the new book we're working on. It's coming out in May. And it's about workplace wellness and well-being. I'll just give you a little bit of preview. Wellness programs don't work. We didn't expect to find that out. And well-being or happiness comes before wellness. So if you're going to invest money, invest it in happiness. That's a code word from taking some stress out of the work. So that's coming out in May. So let me talk about my 3 kids a little bit. Michelle's in the middle, Nathan's in the back, and Tyler's in the front. These kids had the happiest elementary school experience you could ever want. Great teachers, loved them. But something happened in middle school, and I call middle school the great culling out. That's when the one-offs, the unique kids in the world, all of a sudden start finding that they're no longer fit for the system. My daughter has Asperger's. How many are familiar with Asperger's? And she's hyperlexic, which means her vocabulary will scare you. I mean, she knew things when she was she could pronounce words and knew what they meant when she was 3, like echolocation. How many 3-year-olds can tell you what echolocation means? I had to look it up. Okay? So she fools a lot of teachers because she's so hyperlexic. But she still has Asperger's. She still does not get the social cues. So by the time she got to middle school, she was starting to withdraw. By the time she got to high school, she was a target because she was gullible. By the time she was a junior, the emotional stress and trauma on her, we had to pull her out and put her in a smaller, safer school because of what was happening to her and what she was doing to cope with the stress and not having any ability. I mean, she was sexually harassed. She was brutalized, teasing. She was made fun of on a constant basis, and that was her experience. So my son Nathan, the little jokester there, he did fine until middle school, and then we find out this thing called ADHD. How many have ever experienced ADHD? How many have ever had to go to school to find the homework that you know your child did, but it's lost in the backpack, in the locker, or in the desk someplace? Okay. And so my wife was going up 2 and 3 times a week to school because we knew he did the homework. We watched it. And of course, we got it turned in, but it's a day late, or 2 days late, or 3 days late. So what happens if it's a day late? 10%. Okay, you know the rule. What happens if it's 2 days late? 20%. What happens if it's 3 days late? 30%. And you're done. So by his junior year, or senior year, second semester, he says, I'm out of here. Now this is a kid who's an Eagle Scout. So how does Boy Scouts get him to Eagle, but school fail him miserably? Now my wife and I are not incompetent parents. In fact, I'm pretty strong advocate, articulate, researched knowledge. And if we can't get our kids through this machine, what hope does a parent on an hourly wage have who's working maybe 2 jobs to even put the emotional time and energy into that? That's our system. And then Tyler, the third one, when he hit middle school, I had bought a saxophone for him. His buddy was playing trumpet. They were going to be in band. 2 weeks into it, I get a call from my wife, Lisa. She says, I'm not putting up with this for a year. And I go, okay, well, what's this? What's Tyler? He's a bear. He comes home and he's surly and he won't eat the food I prepare for him and he's not cooperative. And I go, okay, let's do an assessment. Now that's part of the work that our company does. We do assessments and we find out where people's sweet spots are and what drains them and what engages them. And so we did the Gallop Strengths Explorer. How many have ever used the Gallop Strengths Explorer? It's a great tool. And we knew right away, I get it. I know why he's coming home drained, because he's in an environment that he doesn't have any autonomy in or control over, and that's part of what makes him tick. And he's got futuristic as a talent, and he's doing boring, mundane work, so that drains him as well. And another talent that he's got is he's the kind of kid who has very few but very deep, close relationships and is not good in kind of open social environments. His 2 best buddies that he went through elementary school with were not in his class. He had 30 new students. So we know, okay, this explains why he's kind of drained by the time he gets home. So we think about it a bit, and 2 weeks later, my wife calls. Again, I'm on the road like I am today. And she says, let's homeschool Tyler. And I said, honey, let's is a plural word. And we're a month into school. We haven't done any research or homework on homeschooling. What's the plan? Because I'm wired on what's the plan. My wife can float with kind of creativity and spontaneity more than I do. And so she got a plan, and I said, I'm good with this. And he flourished, absolutely flourished. I'll tell you the rest of the story at the end. So this is what they experienced. It's the machine. It's always been the machine. It's just that the current world is no longer a machine-driven world. How many are familiar with Ken Robinson? If you haven't watched, he's got the most watched TED Talk of all times. And he talks about how schools are killing creativity and why they're killing creativity. So if you haven't watched it, you've got to watch it. It's a hilarious TED Talk. He also wrote a blurb for a book because he really liked what we were doing. But he talks about the industrial era of education and why schools were designed to create kids who could follow instructions, behave, be disciplined, behave, and follow instructions and write clearly. That's what you needed in a factory or in early administrative areas. Now, our research, when we went out, we wanted a better way to categorize schools based on the experience kids were having in them, the learner experience. We broke it into three major buckets and some subcategories. The first category are what we call future-ready schools. These are schools preparing kids to work in the real world. And if you ask provosts of universities, are you producing kids ready for the world? 90% will say, yes, we're doing it. If you ask CEOs says 13%. 13% of CEOs say, what you're producing out of education, we can plug in and we can use them. So what we found is approximately about 5% of schools out there are really doing the future-ready stuff. And that's the academic rigor plus the non-cognitive, the creativity, the communication, the collaboration kinds of skills out there. And it's a very different kind of environment for those kinds of learning. The environment shapes how you learn things. We found about 45% of schools were what we call well-schooled but poorly educated schools. What we meant was that they can pass tests, they can get into college, they're great at playing the game. They just don't have the creative, cognitive, communication kinds of skills needed to function in this new world. And then we have a category called left behind schools. Up to 50% of our kids are being left behind. They do not have a chance in our economy, in our world. 50% of kids. It broke our hearts. We went to these schools and we went to these districts and we saw why. The system is set up for this. 25% of kids are being left behind because of socioeconomic reasons. And they fall into two categories of schools. Custodial schools, we call them. Those are schools that babysit you through to get you to the next grade. And then survival schools, which are basically war zones. That's 25% of our kids. And then another 25% are being left behind because they have learning differences. And those learning differences don't fit in. How many of you have ever dealt or had somebody deal with a child with learning differences? How many years does it take just to get everybody to figure out what it is we're dealing with? You lose a year or two in this system and you're done, okay? So the big divide and the big mind shift that I want to communicate tonight is this divide between Gutenberg and Google. Our education system is primarily operating in a Gutenberg worldview, and I'll describe and help you see what that is. But we live in a Google world, in a Google race, and I like to describe that the difference we're experiencing is that the world is running round and round the track in this Google race. And we're in the race, but we're in a Gutenberg buggy. And so our solution is to get better tires on the buggy, to get bigger horses on the buggy, to whip the teachers. We do all these things, but it's still a Gutenberg buggy. And it's only going to go as fast as a Gutenberg buggy can go, a one-horse buggy. So the problem is not that the system is broken. And I agree with Jamie Cassip with Google. We've spent too much time talking about and beating up that the system is broken. It's not broken, it's obsolete. And that's a completely different kind of problem. When it's broken, you try to fix it, right? When it's obsolete, you try to figure out what is the new thing we should be doing. How long have we been doing school reform? We've been doing school reform ever since a book came out called Why Can't Johnny Read, 1955. That's how long we've been doing school reform. How well has that worked? So we keep coming back to try to fix something that can't be fixed because it's obsolete. We got to just find a new thing. How many are familiar with a guy named Marshall Mcluhan? Now, I don't expect many to know. We've got a few who know that. Okay. So Marshall Mcluhan was a guru in the 60s that talked about a major shift in the world around that was focused around mediums of communication, that we were in a new medium, and the medium is the message. How many have heard of that phrase? The medium is the message. So what he basically said is that we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. And the primary tool he was talking about is communication. So for example, if you have a hammer, what does that kind of force you to be, what's what's the kind of solutions you look for with a hammer? You look for people to pound, for nails to pound on, right? Freudian slip. Right? If you have a screwdriver, what do you look for? Things to turn this way. I'm not using the word. Okay? All right. So, especially in this public atmosphere. So the different eras of communication that dramatically shifted education fall into 5 categories. So oral communication, think of ancient culture. What was learning like in ancient culture? Small, intimate groups with an older, wiser mentor, and you learned about the life around you. You lived in a 3-mile-an-hour world, and you learned about the world, and it was multi-sensory, it was dialogic and Socratic in style, question-answer, but it was intimate and relational. Then the big change happened in the 1600s with the Gutenberg printing press, about 150 years before that. And what happened there is we went to structured learning. We went from relational learning to structured learning. And I'll describe a little bit more about that because it's important to know what the distinct nature that print does, how print really shapes the way we learn, what we learn, how we learn, the leadership models, and the facilities that we learn in. Then we went through a brief period of broadcast where the learning was about engagement and interest. And programs like Sesame Street came up. But the really next big shift happened in this column called connected active. That was digital. The big shift there is the important shift for us to understand. The agency of learning changed. In other words, the control of learning changed from the teacher, who is packaging content and handing it off, to now the student has control. So it's called pull. The agency of learning has changed. But we're still packaging learning in the old way and handing it off and expecting kids to digest it. But the control and the agency of learning has changed. And our environments do not yet reflect that fundamental shift. Now, I know this is heady stuff for the East Coast at 11, it's 11 o'clock at night your time. So I get that. The next big shift that we're moving into is social mobile. So now it's not only agency, the control of the learner, going from the teacher to the control to the learner, but now it's becoming social, peer social, and it's mobile. It can happen anywhere, any place, any time. So let's talk a little bit about this printing press here, okay? So one of the things that happened is that we pulled the child out of the little tribe and we made the individual the center of learning. We didn't make the group the center of learning, we made the individual the center of learning. And this person had to learn content and master that content. We also standardized meaning and we standardized content. It was never that way in oral culture. If you read any of the ancient oral literatures like the Iliad and the Odyssey, there was lots of versions of that. It was thematic learning, it wasn't literal learning. So this forced things to have fixed meaning and fixed definitions from now and forever. And that's not the way the world is. How many remember Encyclopedia World Book or Britannica, right? Okay. And isn't it wonderful that the whole world's knowledge could be contained in those few books? And wasn't it also great that you only needed an update every year? All the new knowledge you needed was once a year. How many remember that? But that worked back then, right? Because we were moving at that pace and the world wasn't changing all that rapidly. So that was fine. That was the speed that we could handle things. And then the libraries. How many of your schools still have some of these libraries? And are you still using them to hold books? Oh my gosh. Yeah. So interestingly enough, how many have ever heard of behavioral economics? Do you know behavioral economics? Okay, a few of you. So an academic, an economist, and a psychologist walk into a bar. Now this is a true story, so it's not the beginning of a joke. In the 1960s. And they talked about how traditional economics doesn't really explain the way people make real decisions. Traditional economics assumes that because if we give you the right information and the right incentives, you're going to make the right decisions. So in the wellness world, that means if we tell you smoking's going to kill you, and we give you an incentive to stop smoking, that you're going to stop smoking. But people are not rational. So this little group in the 60s started forming and saying, well, let's figure out what people really do, how they really make decisions, and then reverse engineer that into the kinds of incentives that will get people to do things that they want to do. And these are called nudges. How many have ever been to McDonald's and been supersized? Have you ever been supersized? Okay. So that's a nudge. That's called a nudge. You were nudged, but now we're asking, how do we do healthy nudges? How many have 401ks? Okay? How many even think about your 401ks every year? So the big change, the big nudge is that we used to not save in 401ks. And the big change happened is that it used to be an opt-in program. You would have to go through and figure out what to do, but now it's an opt-out. And because of that little change, we've gone from, in companies that use this, we've gone from like a 15% use of 401ks to an 80% use for that one little nudge of opting in or opting out versus opting in. So that whole area. So this book on behavioral economics in the library, would you put it in economics or would you put it in psychology? See, libraries aren't good at figuring that out. But on Amazon, all you have to do is tag it or an Audible, and you can find the book that you want anywhere. So the virtual world. So this world doesn't work anymore. Let's talk about the book. The book is the epitome of how the world is structured, how companies are structured, how projects are structured. So think of a company as the title to a book, okay? And then you go inside and you see that each department has its own section. And so companies are structured like hierarchies, like books are structured in hierarchical form. And you flow through a book in a linear fashion from beginning to end. You don't skip through it. But what we're finding is that that's not how the world works. An organization is not a hierarchy. I don't care what school district you come from. It doesn't work that everything flows down from the top and then it kind of moves over and linearly falls down. How many have to work between departments? You ever have to work between departments? Is it a hassle to work between departments and get permission or help or coordination? But what we know is organizations are really a network, three kinds of networks. They're a network of relationships, a network of commitments, and a network of communications. And we're learning that on construction projects. How many are familiar with lean construction or integrated project delivery? Okay? So we structure projects that way in those kinds of environments, or agile software programming. No hierarchy, no structure, take decisions to the front line and work at it as a network of commitments. Okay, that's how we work on these projects. Well, we're still working and operating in that form or mode. So that's how print has defined our world, constrained our world, and structures everything. Winston Churchill, how many are familiar with this quote? We shape our buildings and they shape us. So classroom in 1950s. Now I was in school in the 1960s. It looked pretty much like that. How many were in classrooms that looked pretty much like that? Okay. The only difference is that in my classroom, we didn't have kids with suits and ties on. Yeah. But outside of that, it was pretty similar. And it was black and white. I'd go to school, it was black and white. How many went to black and white schools? Okay. So Dan Boggio, the principal for PBK, their large K12 school, he said a couple of years ago, they're still being asked, 85% of the schools that are designing, they're still being asked to design schools that look like they were designed thought about in the 1950s and 60s. 85% are still being specified and asked to be designed this way. This is a school that we took a picture of 2 years ago. How different is that than the 1950s classroom? Here's a brand new school in Hawaii. Brand new school. Beautiful school. What? I mean, come on. Look at this. This is even more. What are these chairs made to do? Yeah, to move. But, so one of the challenges you have in the facilities world is that you can bring a great architect in and designer and design great stuff, but we need to train the teachers on what the new learning is and the new methodology of learning. One of my favorite songs is Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd. How many are familiar with that song? They captured what was going on, this kind of depersonalized, everybody is kind of the same. But we live in a world where I believe the human opportunity is that kids can be individuals, they can learn individually, and they can discover what they're uniquely designed to do, and we can help facilitate them to get there. I'm a performance coach. I work with executives and professional athletes. How many are familiar with the Gallop Strength Finder assessment? Okay. There are 33,600,000 combinations of just the top 5 talents. 33,600,000 combinations of just those top 5. And that doesn't take into life experience and all the things that go with that. I mean, we're truly unique. And we have that opportunity in learning and teaching to get there. So the ultimate rite of passage are the SAT, ACTs. Standardized tests in a structured world, teaching standardized knowledge in a standardized way. And you know, if any of those kids were to look over at somebody else and say, hey, look, I'm not so good at this part. Let me help you. I'm good at this part. Would you help me with that part? What would happen to those kids? They would be booted out, right? But when they go to work, what is that called? That's called collaboration, right? So we're not setting our kids up to survive and succeed in this world. So just having been with a group of superintendents, and they're an interesting group too, you know, I ask what keeps them up at night? And what keeps them up is this race that we're in. It's changing so fast, and the parents are demanding, they want kids to be successful. And that's a two-edged sword, because they don't want anything to really change dramatically, because they don't want anything to mess up Johnny or Susie's SAT, ACT. But they want it all to be current state. So what's happening is this Google world is calling us. It's knocking on our door. We're immigrants into the world. We still live primarily in the Gutenberg world, at least thinking-wise. I mean, you may have a cool phone and you may have a cool computer, but your kids still are programming your VCR, right? And for a lot of teachers, this new world looks like this indecipherable code. What does it mean? What does active learning look like? What's project-based learning? What do I do? We had a teacher in Sarasota say, you know what? I'm really good at getting up and putting lesson plans together and teaching. This new environment of letting go and expecting the kids to do it and creating experiences, I got to tell you, I'm not really comfortable. I know I need to, she was honest and she was almost in tears. I know I need to get there. I just don't know how. So the learning now is pull-based. In other words, this is what kids experience. This is learning today. Give them a problem, put a bunch of kids together. You know, my youngest son now is a music major at the University of North Texas. It's known as the best jazz school in the country. He had a chance to go to Berkeley in Boston. He wants to do movie score composing. Now, when we homeschooled him, I said you had to pick an instrument, you have to do something social, and you have to do something physical every day. So we picked keyboard. So about 3 weeks into this, and my wife's helping him get started, my wife calls and says, hey, we need to get Tyler music lessons. And I'm going, okay, how much do music lessons cost and why? And so she had him play, and he had gone onto YouTube because he heard someone play Canon in D. He had learned how to play it, and it was incredible. That's pull. He had an interest. He went and found out how to do it. He figured out how to do it. Now he's doing his passion in school. That's pull. That's the world of pull. Are we providing that kind of experience in our schools? Are we providing the kind of environments that allow kids to discover and learn? Wikipedia. And in 2005, I brought my iPod. That was what it looked like back in 2005. And Wikipedia. And you would have thought I was a heretic in that university speaking to a bunch of faculty. But this is the new competition. The content is not the issue, because the content is here. It's the experience that we have to create. And learning starts before school. How many have seen grandkids, nieces, and whatever on the iPads learning and playing? But we don't take that into account when the kids come into school, and we don't even facilitate that. The selfie generation, that little phone that person's holding onto, that's it. That's the portal to the world. And do we access and use it and leverage it? And do we teach proper use, safe use of the technology? When we grew up, we learned grammar and syntax, how to communicate in the written world. We don't treat or teach what is the proper grammar and syntax in a digital world. We let kids pick it up off the street, like other things that we don't want them to pick up from just anybody's knowledge. Studies show that these kids may be digitally savvy in terms of the technology, but they really don't know how to use it. They don't know how to research with it. They don't know how to vet truth. They don't know how to discipline themselves with it. And it's an addictive tool. And the age is going beyond. Also, we're moving into a visual learning era. I mean, this is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. Well, I've got an infographic on it now. So let's talk a little bit about experience design, and then I'll wrap this up here. What's so great about a playground? Designing a playground. Why are playgrounds successful? They're fun. They have one purpose. What's the one purpose? Yeah, to have fun and to create an experience of fun. Now, if we could think about what is the experience you're trying to create, is part of learning fun, or should it be? Okay, how many environments can you actually walk into and say, boy, this is fun. I'm going to have a fun day of learning today. What else do you want to do in a playground? Explore, experiment? How many can walk into a school and say, boy, this is a place I feel like I can explore and experiment? Gensler just came out this week, just came out with this experience index. And I think it's fascinating because I think we can use some of the framework and apply it to education. They start out with, what is the intention of the environment that we've got? Okay? Now, this, of course, is for business and social, but is it a social intention? Is it a work task intention? Is it a discovery intention? Is it an entertainment intention? And then, what supports that? What's your expectation going into that environment? When you go into, I don't know, a cheesecake factory, what's your expectation there? Yeah, cheesecake, okay. And a really broad menu, right? Okay. And a noisy environment. You know what you're going to get. What's your expectations when you go into a Starbucks? Are we asking the same question? What's the expectation of going into a STEM classroom or a group, a social studies classroom? So we've got expectations we can work with. Then the space. Does the space support the intention and the expectation? And then what interaction is it facilitating? Is it group interaction we're primarily facilitating? Is it individual focus work we're facilitating? Is it collaborative work, teacher relationship? And then the other thing we should be thinking about in terms of facilities is that the magical experience happens with the teacher and the student. But we create an environment and a context around that has to support the pedagogy or the methodology. It's got to integrate the technology, and it's got to provide a supportive environment. And then finally, we've got different kinds of new learning going on. We've got to integrate technology. We've got to have more mobility of the learner. That's the agency side. We've got to touch into multiple modalities. And then we've got to be able to adapt to different kinds of learning. And then finally have some dynamic ergonomics. What we've recently learned is that, how many have seen that we've got an obesity problem even in the schools right now? Okay? And what Texas A&M's research has found is that if you give a kid who is overweight or obese a standing work area, it helps regulate the blood sugar enough that they can perform at the same level as a regular kid. Same with ADHD, if you give an ADHD kid. So we're learning all these things about environmental performance that we need to apply. So part of what's happening to create this learner experience is that some teachers are stepping out and trying to experiment, and they're bringing in architects and the kids and the teachers. And this is an example in Sarasota where they were working to create a STEM school, but they started first of all, and this was new for the curriculum. The first thing they wanted to do is figure out, so what's the day going to look? Let's mock up the day. Let's work and see what the experience is going to be like. Now, there were several unique things that came out of this. This is the school. This is the result. The first thing they found is that the work surfaces are a custom size so the kids could reach across easily. And so the manufacturer accommodated that. The other thing, too, I'll just point out, there are several, but I'll just point out two. They decided not to go with individual tablets because they found that the kids weren't talking to each other. So they intentionally went to this monitor arm so everybody is around talking to each other. So again, that gets into the intentionality and looking at the interface and the experience and the pedagogy. What are we teaching here? What's the experience going to be like? Let's design the environment to support that. But they started by mocking it up with cardboard. So if I were to ask you, what does this learning experience communicate to you? What's the experience here that you would expect? What's that? Ideation, okay. And how well do you think it provides that? So we can do a rating. Is it good? Is it rich? Or is it transformative? Is that good, rich, or transformative? Rich, okay. This one, what's the experience that this is telling you that it will provide? Freedom, okay. Yep, autonomy. Is it good? Does it do it well? Is it rich or is it transformative? So we're beginning to get a vocabulary and a lexicon to evaluate space. What's the intention? What's the experience? What's the experience here? What are we trying to do? What's that? Flexibility, okay? You want to be able to adapt and reconfigure and work with different people. Is it good? Is it rich or transformative? Transformative, okay. No wrong answers. What's the experience they're trying to create here? Collaboration. Is it good? Is it rich? Or is it transformative? Okay, it's rich, okay. What's the experience we're trying to create here? Okay, experiential, curiosity. Is it good? Is it rich? Or is it transformative? Transforming, okay, for this woman here, this is transformative. I agree with you. Finally, what's this experience what's the experience here? A little personal mentoring, right? So a safe place, intimate place, is it good? Is it rich? Or is it transformative? So what I want you to understand is I want you to go back and begin looking at the spaces through what is the intent here? What's the experience we're trying to create? What are the touch points here? And is it good? Do we have a good design to facilitate that? Is it rich or is it transformative? So we're on the other side of the matrix. Hopefully now you're beginning to see some of the patterns and shapes of this new world that we're responsible for and these new kids. Hopefully we've been able to look at looking at these spaces through the experience, through the pure experience of learning. What's that pure learning experience we're trying to create? And not get into the weeds of just budgets and schedules and getting things done. So what's happened to my kids? Well, they're all freshmen in college now. Lucky me, right? Nathan is at Dakota State learning cybersecurity, which fits him perfectly. He's a hacker from way back. Michelle is getting her basics done at the local community college because she wants to go into graphic design and costume design, and her costumes are incredible. Okay, she's already put in a request to Santa Claus for a certain kind of sewing machine, and I said, I'm not sure Santa Claus lives here anymore, but we'll find out. And of course, I told you Tyler's in college at University of North Texas. So I want to end with a couple things that you can go back. First, let's get the conversation started and begin asking the questions. What's the space for, and how good is it? Let's create some demonstration areas. Bring some vendors in to create some mock-ups and areas so your teachers can see and learn about what the new learning experiences are. Advocate for your teachers. You know, get the teacher voice and the student voice into the decisions about facilities. They count. And then there's lots of micro environments that you can already change. If you've got a library, change it out to a learning lounge. If you've got little cubby holes and things, turn them into little collaborative areas. There's lots we can do in those areas. So I want to thank you. A couple things that we'll offer. One, I've got 9 free copies of this thinking guide to the book. So we'll have some books for sale. They're $20 a piece, so they're $45 off. But the first 9 get a free, a way to go to the website and get a free copy of that. And then I just want to thank you for the time. And do we have time for questions, or are we done?
We have time for a couple questions.
Okay.
We got one over there.
Okay, all right. Right.
But it's so hard to deploy. It's not hard, it's easy, because the people that experience it are excited by it, but to get it out there is a task.
It's a huge task.
And you know, and I look for, you know, we're doing it in such a small way, but yet everybody who comes in is and experiences it is touched by it, and they embrace it, and they go out and do something. So what is it that one could deploy across the entire state enterprise?
Yeah.
No,
I think what you're doing, I think the key word is once they experience it, because it truly is, it's like going to another country. You can tell somebody about the Google country, but until you experience it like what you're doing, creating these places people can come and experience. And then professional development. We're so underfund and undersupport professional development. The teaching load actually goes down in this new environment, and the creative juices get released. But what you're doing, creating that demonstration facility, if every district could have a demonstration facility and just keep bringing people in to experience, and then starting with one area in a school, small area, and let that go. The tipping point is about 20% adoption, then it takes a life of its own. So you're looking to get to that critical mass. And maybe just start with one school with one principal who's more open-minded, and then really put your energy. We find if you really put your energy in the areas you can get leverage, which is a creative principal who wants to do it, and you get 1 or 2 proof cases, then it begins to go, because nobody wants to be left behind. Nobody wants to be the first out of the chute. But then once somebody gets out of the chute and breaks the 4-minute mile, nobody wants to be left behind. So focus on that 1 or 2 principals that want to do it.
So that's the nudge.
That's the nudge. Don't be left behind, yeah, right. And we've got a couple stories in the book that talk about some districts that went through that kind of thing. Yep. Another question?
I think one of the biggest problems that people find in this room is that there's still gatekeepers above them.
Right.
So looking at universities that are still demanding SAT, ACT scores,
Right.
standardized
So,
testing.
I got it. So, but it's a false choice because what's happening is engagement is the key to learning. So if you focus on engagement, they'll get their scores right. Okay? High Tech High went through the whole challenge of everybody doubted, how's my kid going to get into college doing this stuff because you're not teaching to the test? The counterintuitive thing is that when you teach to the test, you drain engagement. Nobody cares. So they're not learning anyway. So if you can get the courage to focus on engagement and look at what that is around a rigor or a curriculum, you'll get the test scores. But it takes leadership courage to do that.
But when you get past the test scores and have new criteria for acceptance.
Well, that's a whole nother thing. I mean, the tests are bullshit anyway, so, I mean, they don't prepare you for anything in life.
But I mean, that's the next step in this conversation is
Right.
to find the criteria.
Right. Yeah, but for what you and I can do, we can't affect that, but we can affect engagement. So I say, let's affect engagement, because an engaged kid is going to pass the test. Okay. One more question. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Oh, we got one? Oh. Okay. My bifocals can't see that far. Go ahead. Ah, yes. The calendar and the number of credits. We talk about that in the book, by the way. Right. For pensions. Right. Right. Right, right, right. Totally agree. Right. It's a great point. It's a great point. Yeah, that's a boil the ocean question. So I keep focusing on where we can make a difference, and that's empowering teachers, creating engagement, creating environments that are safe and exciting to come to, and getting the community involved. So that's a big part of it too. You can get so there are schools that are not following the Carnegie unit, but that's because the community has come together to solve the problem. If you ever get a chance to go to Columbus, Indiana, what a great education system they have there. So thank you very much. For this hour of the night, you did a great job. I will stick around up back. We've got some books, but I'll also be around to answer questions. I look forward to seeing you tonight and tomorrow. Take care.